Appreciate your hanging in there. A little chilly? Okay. All right, Mr. Cochran, you may continue with your closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you all came back. I appreciate that. Oh, I guess so. Now, where were we when we left off? We were talking about demeanor, Mr. Simpson's demeanor, and I think I had posed a question with you just before we took our break about Howard Bingham, the photographer who testified here, and I asked you the question, a rhetorical question, about who would know O.J. Simpson the better and his mood and how he appeared on this night, the prosecutors or Mr. Bingham, who'd known him for such a long time. It was a serious question because prosecutors, I presume, never met Mr. Simpson before we started this process. So I think it would be relevant for you to know about how somebody who knew him over a period of time saw him on that particular date, especially when they go into their doctor mode and they use terms like post-homicidal conduct. There's been no testimony in this case at all about post-homicidal conduct and about demeanor, about anybody acts in a post-homicidal conduct. That, again, is more speculation. But what we did in this case was we tried to call for you a number of witnesses who I think bear on this issue of demeanor, which it seems to us is totally relevant. For one thing, it totally rebuts this specious theory about any kind of a fuse or any rage that you've seen. We've done that. We've shared that with you already. And in the course of wrapping that up, keep in mind that both Cato Kalin and Alan Park fall into the category of demeanor witnesses who place Mr. Simpson's demeanor as being entirely appropriate. And these are people's witnesses, so it doesn't matter whether we call the witnesses or they do. If you're in a search for truth, you look and see if there's a common thread of truth that runs throughout these witnesses, and I think we found that. Now, one of the things that I wanted to share with you, yesterday, Ms. Clark in her argument tried to indicate something to the fact that Mr. Simpson didn't want Cato Kalin, I believe, to spend time with him or something of that nature, as though he wanted to get rid of Cato Kalin. It was part of her theory there. And I went back and I looked at the testimony at 19854, Ms. Clark herself, when questioning Cato Kalin. When you got to that location, what did you do? When I got to the door, yes, I turned. Okay, what did you see? OJ. And where was he? At the driver's side door of the Rolls. Did you say anything to him? No. What did you do? I looked and said, I'll eat in my room. And then he went off and ate in his room. But there was no, further on it says, did you have any conversation with Mr. Simpson? Answer was no. And he said nothing to you? No. So I think that was important to understand and put that record straight, that there was no discussion about whether Cato would go in the house with Mr. Simpson or whatever. They didn't talk. Cato went back to his room. Simpson was still out at his Bentley, presumably trying to get ready to, go on this trip, which was long planned. There'd been some mention earlier of an argument at a Christmas party. And I wanted to, again, try and set the record straight before we went on with demeanor, because I pulled up Cato Kalin's testimony again. And what he says was that after question, did everybody go home together? Answer, yes. Everybody celebrate Christmas Eve back at home? Answer, at Rockingham, yes. Question, Nicole, OJ, and the kids? Answer, yes. Question, and yourself? Answer, and Arnell and Jason? Question, whole family? Yes. Now, what they do is they tell you, well, there was an argument at the Jenners, and what they don't tell you was, remember the testimony was, they left the Jenners to go back home because it was Christmas Eve, and they all celebrated Christmas Eve together. So you got to have the whole picture, don't you? Don't you think that seems reasonable? And there was some question about the flashlight, and here's what Cato Kalin had to say about that, where he says, then I said, OJ, do we have a better flashlight? And when I told him about the noise, he was going to take one way, I was going to go another way. But that is when I said, we have this lousy flashlight, we need another one. And so he was going to go inside and check. And then they went in the house, he followed behind. And then that's when Mr. Simpson had to then leave for the airport. So I think that, again, I promised you I would always try to read the actual testimony to make it as clear as I could about where we were. A few other housekeeping things before we get directly into the demeanor aspect. Ms. Clark yesterday had made a number of points about phone calls and boards to Paula Barbieri. And you'll recall we saw a number 305, which I think is in the Miami area code. And I think the evidence is that's a cell phone of some kind. And certainly if you call that phone number out here, you can reach people on a cell phone. And I find nothing unusual about that in regards to the calls that were made. There also was some discussion about what Dr. Batten had to say about these cuts or cut on Mr. Simpson's hand. You recall that Brian Kilberg came back down here again, and he asked some questions of Dr. Batten. And I tried to pull up this testimony so I'd have it clear about when Mr. Simpson had gone to the Bronco to get the portable phone, when he went back to the Bronco apparently to get the paraphernalia in that phone, and try to piece together as to when he got a small cut on his hand, not any large fishhook cut, which I think was clear from the evidence, at what point that he may have bled inside that Bronco and may or may not have known that. And so we read Batten, and this is at page 41182. Question by Mr. Kilberg, I believe. What, if anything, did Mr. Simpson have to say as to the manner when he got the cuts? Answer, that he recalls some blood after trying to retrieve his phone or some material from the Bronco, from a car that he had his phone. I think it was the Bronco, that he'd gone to the Bronco to get something and may have somehow cut himself while getting stuff from the Bronco to bring with him to Chicago. Well, I think that it's important to tie this in with the fact that, remember that Cato Kalin and I think even Alan Park indicated that by the time they were there, when Mr. Simpson finally came down the stairs, when he left, there were bags already down. Certainly the golf bag and this other bag, there were bags already out there. So he'd been outside in that yard, and apparently, according to Ms. Clark's testimony, had been at some point out to the Bronco, and at some point he'd gotten this phone, this portable phone. But we know he'd gotten it because he'd made a phone call on that phone by 10 o'clock or by 10:03. Car wasn't moving. This is a portable phone. And remember, I asked Gigi Guerin, were there any portable phones inside that house? The testimony, there were none. So there was no wireless telephone at Rockingham. So I think the testimony is, and the reasonable inference is, that Mr. Simpson made that cell phone from that location to her cell phone number 305, area code. And then once they left, as I told you, they left with Park, and we know that was around 11:02. So now Mr. Simpson's in the car, and as you know how Park describes O.J. Simpson. Nothing out of the ordinary. He says he's hot, but that's nothing unusual. And then Mr. Simpson gets to the airport. Do you remember those two young men who came in? Michael Norris and Michael Gladden. And these are the two airport couriers who were parked at the curb there, and one of them, Gladden, wanted to get Mr. Simpson's autograph. You'll recall that. And so even though Mr. Simpson was rushed and trying to get to the plane or whatever, he stopped and he gave his O.J. Simpson Peace to You. That was a signature that he gave at about, I think the testimony was 11:25 that particular night on June 12th. That was a testimony of Gladden. And remember, they described O.J. Simpson as being kind of like a model or some kind of a poster boy for these jeans or whatever he had on. I think the way they described it, they felt that he was dressed very neatly, looked very clean, is the way they described him. And he was very approachable. He put some luggage down and then turned around and forgot about the autograph and then gave the autograph. You recall that. It was very interesting because Ms. Clark said yesterday something to the effect, well, Mr. Simpson didn't put on his socks because he left his socks at home. Now, that was one of the most interesting things she said. You've been in this man's closet. You think that O.J. Simpson has one pair of socks? I don't think so. I think you saw his closet. You saw the clothes, the way they were lined up, and the way they were. In fact, remember, I asked the witness the question, is it trendy, is it fashionable that a lot of people in that part of town don't wear socks when they get dressed up to go out? Somebody said, yes, that's fashionable, that's what happens. O.J. Simpson has lots of socks. And the evidence is, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because under the prosecution's theory, if you follow their theory, you're asked to believe that Mr. Simpson is in sweats and tennis shoes, and I presume tennis socks. That he gets this urge to go and kill his wife, and he takes off his tennis shoes and his tennis socks and puts on some dress socks and dress shoes. That doesn't make any sense, does it? But keeps on his sweat clothes according to them. That's how preposterous their theory is, to try to make things fit. And you're going to see, you're going to understand that even better when we talk about these socks. So as O.J. Simpson then gets on the plane. And it was interesting because not only did he deal with Norris and Gladden, but he had an interesting man in the first class across from Steve Valerie. You saw Valerie, young man who, for pretty much most of that flight, watched O.J. Simpson. Mr. Douglas, what's that number, sir?
1245.
1245, it just gives you some idea of this plane. We've talked earlier about Bingham, and remember Valerie was right across from O.J. Simpson as he sat up there in the fourth seat or something like that. And he watched him and noticed him and described for you Mr. Simpson's demeanor. He looked at O.J. Simpson's hands. That was really one of the important things about it. Because again, when Ms. Clark, who was Dr. Clark in this regard, talked to you about this cut or whatever, she was describing how a little cut wouldn't make this amount of blood, but this larger cut. By all of the witnesses who didn't know each other, O.J. Simpson did not have this fishhook cut on his hand when he went to Chicago. That's unanimous. All the witnesses. You heard them. You saw them. Further, you heard the testimony of Drs. Heisinger and Baden, who said, this is not consistent with a knife cut, it's consistent with some kind of glass cut because it's raggedy, it's jagged. You remember that? You remember the testimony? And we can prove it further by witnesses who saw him before he was in that room in Chicago and witnesses who saw him after. And we'll talk about that. So on the plane was Bingham, and then we had the pilot on the plane. And the pilot who was flying the plane came back and asked Mr. Simpson to autograph the logbook, which he did, and I think we have a photograph of that. Again, you saw Pilot Stansfield, who described how Mr. Simpson was seated there reading a book, a light shining down on him, not trying to hide from anybody, not anything, sitting there reading his book, looked up, talked to the pilot, and gave his autograph, and they both continued on with their business. Then he gets to Chicago and he lands, and he deals with Jim Merrill, the Hertz driver. You'll recall him. The Hertz driver describes the number of bags that Mr. Simpson has. In the luggage when he arrives, he describes the duffel bag, the black duffel bag, the garment bag with OJS, the golf bag, the Louis Vuitton bag. All those bags are described by Merrill. And then, of course, you remember we talked about the knapsack bag, which we think logically had golf balls in it. It was inside the golf bag. So Merrill watched O.J. in the luggage area meet with some, I think, say 20 different fans while waiting for his luggage. Merrill says he was friendly, relaxed, and he saw no noticeable cuts on his hands. That's what Jim Merrill told us. This was his testimony. So we brought him here from Chicago to testify in that regard. Now I want you to contrast Mr. Simpson's demeanor and behavior after he goes to this hotel room in Chicago. After he learns of his ex-wife's death, everybody is consistent. And again, these witnesses don't know this person. He was emotional, concerned with a cut finger. Dave Kilduff. And Mr. Simpson gets the call. And here's what I want you to think with me for a moment. I want you to look at how he reacts to this information. We've already covered how his daughter describes him. She's never heard him like this before. He immediately gets plane reservations to come back to Los Angeles. He's then trying to get back, frantically trying to leave this hotel. It's early in the morning. He's trying to get back to Los Angeles on the first thing flying. He's trying to get somebody to take him back to the airport. He's there to play in a golf tournament that day. Obviously, that's never going to happen. So we know that Dave Kilduff, the Hertz manager, drove Mr. Simpson to the airport. Remember how he describes? Now, this is the first witness. O.J. Simpson's finger is bleeding. And this fishhook cut, this cut that he got in that room when that broken glass was there. For the prosecutors, again, with a cynical view, say, well, that couldn't have happened. Dr. Batten says that in talking to Mr. Simpson, he got that cut when he brushed this glass into the sink. It's entirely consistent. Doctors deal with cuts, and they said this is consistent with a glass cut. Kilduff says that O.J. Simpson is crying and he's upset. He finally makes the plane, and I think it's important to note that when he makes the plane, he sits next to, I think in seat 9, to a lawyer by the name of Mark Partridge, just fortuitous. And I thought it was very interesting about this man Partridge. Remember, he's the man who was a patent lawyer, who'd gone to Harvard, and he observed O.J. Simpson on this flight back. He saw him make these phone calls. He saw his emotional state. He saw him trying to gather information. He saw his finger. He saw the Band-Aid he'd had that came off. He saw that it was cut. You saw his testimony. These were all citizen timeline witnesses, like you or I, who were brought here pursuant to subpoena. They didn't ask to be here. They didn't volunteer, but they had relevant information about what had taken place and what had happened. So it seems to me that we, in our search for justice and our journey toward the city of justice, must take these witnesses seriously. But you understand, with the power of the state, the prosecution had an equal access to all these witnesses, but they didn't call them. They didn't call them because they didn't fit. They didn't fit and they didn't want to hear. So the prosecutors decided to attack. And you'll remember how these witnesses generally were treated. I thought Partridge was treated especially bad. Here's a man who was so concerned about no one stealing his notes. He wrote notes about what took place, not to publish them. He's a patent lawyer, so he understood. He put his name on the side in the margin to write down his notes because he knew it would be important. Remember, he said he knew this would be important. And he sent those notes to the prosecution and to the defense. Said, I'm just a witness here. This is what I saw. Can I be of some help? They chose not to call him. They chose to attack him as though he had like something to hide. In fact, remember Ms. Clark standing and saying something to the effect, well, do you know how busy the LAPD was when they didn't have time to respond to you? Well, maybe not. But this was an important witness. That was the only person in the world who sat next to O.J. Simpson on a flight back from Chicago when everything he was doing, continues to do, was consistent with innocence. They didn't want to hear it, but we brought this again for you to hear. And I ask you to judge this witness as you do all the others. You remember Mark Partridge, and I think you will. And remember that it was unfair to attack a witness, a citizen witness, who seemed to be totally objective and careful. Then there was Ken Barris, the police officer in Chicago. Ms. Clark talked about him coming out here, but we brought him out here. We brought Ken Barris out here. He was the police officer who maybe 3 hours after O.J. Simpson left that room, went into that room at the O'Hare Plaza, was it? 11 o'clock or thereabouts, I believe. He said he went in the room. He found the glass. He found the doily. He found the towel. He found the bedding because the maids had not done anything with regard to that room. He found this broken glass. And the evidence is, contrary to what the prosecutor would try to tell you, is that this glass was consistent with O.J. Simpson cutting his hand on it. And this is the cut, it's the fishhook cut. Now, you characterize witnesses like Cato Kalin and Partridge Denise Pilnack and some others who felt the wrath of the prosecution, and you have to ask yourself why in a search for truth. Why did that happen? Then Mr. Simpson returns back from Chicago, and this was very interesting. And you will recall, because Officer Don Thompson, I saw some of you looking at him, he's a very, very impressive big fellow. He's about 6'7" or 8", he's a big guy. And you remember, he's the officer who was very interesting and very honest, because he said that immediately upon Mr. Simpson coming back to Rockingham at 12 noon now, on June 13th, what happens? Van Adder had told him to hook him up. Let's see that if we can. We'll give you the number in a minute, Your Honor. You'll recognize Officer Thompson and Mr. Simpson. You notice he grabbed hold to him at that moment. You'll recall that Officer Thompson had testified how he'd been told by Van Adder to hook him up or to handcuff him. He grabbed him by the arm as he went in there, and you recall the photograph. I think that's Thompson there in the background, in the foreground. Thought Mr. Harris had that, but at any rate, you'll recall Mr. Simpson was standing over under a tree and he was handcuffed until the lawyer Howard Weitzman came. You recall that because we saw that during the trial. Howard Weitzman, lawyer, he's talking to Mr. Simpson. See that Mr. Simpson is taking out Van Adder's going over to him and taking the handcuffs off, I believe, as the conversation goes on with Howard Weitzman. All right, he's unhandcuffed at this point. Thank you, Mr. That was number 1250, was it? 527? 1250, Your Honor. The point of that was, we have said, and I told you at the beginning and told you in the opening statement and told you again today, this was a rush to judgment. At 12 o'clock on June 13th, Van Adder told Thompson to handcuff O.J. Simpson or to hook him up. Van Adder lied about that because he said in his testimony he never told him that. Thompson was very clear that he told him. He didn't do that on his own. But it shows this rush to judgment. Van Adder did not want to admit that and never did. We'll talk more about him when we discuss the officers together. But it seems to me the important thing for us to remember is that after this video, Mr. Simpson, you'll recall, is on his way downtown in a vehicle with Van Adder and Lang. You remember Howard Weitzman talks to Van Adder. Simpson gets in the car with the police in the back. Goes downtown without either his business lawyer or Howard Weitzman. Rides with the police. We know, according to the testimony in this case, he talks with Van Adder and Lang once he gets down there. I think we asked both of them about this conversation. We've heard nothing else about this conversation. He has no lawyer in there with him. Has no lawyer in the car when he goes downtown. After he makes this statement to the police, which we haven't heard, he then gives a blood sample sometime around 2 o'clock or whatever that afternoon on the 13th. He voluntarily gives his blood sample. He then has a photograph taken of the cut on his finger. There's no lawyer present during all that. The lawyers are someplace else at that point. So Simpson is dealing with this himself. So he wants to clear this up. He's innocent. He wants to get it over with. Everything this man does is consistent with innocence. He finds out. He gets the first thing smoking. He comes back here. He goes right to his residence. He talks to the police. He goes downtown with the police. He goes in a room with the police. He has his finger photographed. He gives blood. His lawyers are off someplace else. That's what this man did on June 13th. They weren't there then. That's what he did, consistent with innocence. They want to talk about luggage. The testimony, again, of this honest police officer, Thompson, is that they wouldn't let O.J. Simpson's luggage on the premises. They talk about Bob Kardashian. They smear Bob Kardashian, a good and successful, decent businessman and friend. He can't come on the premises. They have to take the luggage away. Now, these people have search warrants. They can do whatever they want to do at that point. They have the power of the state. And they have the audacity to stand here and tell you that when retired Judge Delbert Wong brings in the Louis Vuitton bag months and months and months later, there's no clothes in it? Now, is that folly? They're not supposed to unpack it? That is silly. I shouldn't waste my time on it, but that's what was said here. You heard it. And they are the ones who turned away the luggage. So you remember that when they stand up here and try to talk to you about any luggage and they didn't have it, or what was in the luggage, or what was it. He brought the luggage back. And if he didn't have, by the way, that portable phone in his luggage, you'd hear about that also. So understand, we're going to talk about the facts, not any speculation. So what more then could an innocent man do? We talked briefly about the cut or cuts on O.J. Simpson's hand. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the one cut, and these officers are there with their photographer. They take a photograph of this cut. But you remember in those other pictures, there was a cut on the side of his finger here, or a nick or something like that. Looked like a paper cut, I think they said. And it's interesting, because if that cut had been there, June 13th, at 2 o'clock or whatever time they took it, do you think the police would have taken a photograph of that? They didn't, because it probably wasn't there at that point. So it's very interesting. This is the only cut they got. But we know that he nicked himself in several places, according to what he told Dr. Michael Batten. Ms. Clark makes a big thing about some smear or some little tiny smear of blood in the bathroom upstairs. O.J. Simpson had been back home since Friday. Shaved, whatever. I don't know when that got there. He didn't know when that got there. But it struck you as strange that under her hypothesis, under her theory, he comes back home with these bloody shoes on, bloody clothes, with his white carpet, goes upstairs. There's no blood anywhere. There's a little tiny speck in the bathroom. Does that seem to you to be reasonable or rational or related to this case? One thing about blood spots, you can never date them. You can never tell generally how old they are. Another thing that doesn't fit, the fingerprints. They didn't call them, but we called. Gilbert Aguilar. You remember that. He's the fingerprint expert. He examined and dusted and found 17 latent prints that he was able to lift at Bundy. The crime scene, the gate, the fence, the front door. He was able to identify 8 of the prints after comparing the known exemplars of the known ones being the police officers and people that you might expect around there. But there were 9 identifiable prints that were never identified. Remember I asked about these various systems that you can put the prints in. It doesn't work for palms, but it works for prints. What efforts did you take to try to find out who do these 9 identifiable prints belong to? To this day, we don't know. Are those the prints of the real killers? We will never know. They have not found those prints. We brought this witness in for you. We established this for you. The fingernail scrapings. And Mr. Scheck will talk more about this EAPB. But remember, there's no literature. to justify how they'd want to contort and twist this. This double-banded B is more like a B than anything they can ever justify. And it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in their case, so they can't explain it. It's like the number 4 allele on the steering column. There's no number 4s in this case. It doesn't fit. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. They don't, and they cannot explain that. Dr. Irwin Golden, the missing coroner. This man was trashed by his own department. It was brutal by his own boss. And if he thinks he was going to be treated any better, remember how Kelberg dismissed him at the end. He said, by the way, next time you come and testify, learn how to speak slower. That was his last remarks to a man. You look at your notes. His last remarks to a man he kept on this stand for 8 days to tell us that the cause of death was stabbing. The time of death was between 9 and 12. That it could have been a single edge, a double edge knife. That's how they treated their own witness they kept here, the coroner of Los Angeles County. But they didn't call Dr. Goldman. Why not? Why is that? Why are we left to speculate about that? They didn't like his testimony? He couldn't help them. It's the more logical and reasonable inference, isn't it? Whenever there's a witness, if they couldn't fit within their little theory, they abandon him and talk bad about him or rush to judgment. Detective Phillips, the very, very beginning of this case, remember I had Phillips as a witness. He's a nice man. And I quote him when he said, remember when he called the coroner after all these hours out there. Now, you remember he's off the case by then, too, because, you know, the robbery homicide division is taken over. They find that out at 2 something in the morning, remember? And they wait for Lang and Van Etter to come until after 4 something. But here's Phillips still out there now. They're over at Bundy, and they call the coroner. It's like 8 hours later now, as I recall. And what does he say? There's a little tape, I think, that we may have. He says, I think, quote, we're sort of breaking the rules here. They're worried about how they're going to look. They're worried about the press more than they're worried about these bodies that are still out there, more than they're worried about people traipsing through that crime scene, more than they're worried about trying to protect the innocent and pursue the guilty, which they should be doing, which they're required to do under the law. Notify the coroner immediately.
We're kind of not following procedures, but we're kind of asking a favor and, you know, kind of work a little bit on this one.
Okay, you're at the scene now?
Yeah.
Okay, but what is your call-out number at the station? 310?
575-8441.
Do we have names on these people?
No, I don't.
Okay, both males or?
Male, female, a female and a male.
All right, are they Caucasian?
It appears as both.
We're sort of breaking the rules, not calling criminalists. This is in the early morning hours. You remember that? Look at your notes. It's like 8 o'clock or so, isn't it? 6 o'clock. Now it's 8 o'clock because they're back from Rockingham. It's 8 o'clock in the morning now. His bodies were found by Risky at 12:13. Coroner didn't come until about 10 o'clock. Remember that? Fung, when he does come, goes to Rockingham before he goes to Bundy. Sort of not following the rules. That's what this case is all about. Not following the rules. They're more worried about vanity and things like that, not about these victims. We can demand more and should demand more of our police, and it does become very relevant. Tied in with this, and so let me make it clear. We heard yesterday some snide comment about, well, we had the best witnesses that money could buy, or something like that in this case. Consider Dr. Henry Lee. By all accounts, the #1 criminalist in America, probably in the world. He didn't take any money. The money for his time that O.J. Simpson had to pay went to the state of Connecticut to help the police and police funds. You heard that testimony. So it's a real unfortunate thing when lawyers stand here and demean people with national wonderful reputations who come in here who get compensated only for their time. The only ones not being compensated for their time here are you, and we apologize for that. But these other witnesses, the law allows them to be paid for their time out of their offices. You heard that. Not doing this to make money, be subjected to this, be on television every day, have people probing into your private lives. Nobody wants that. It's not any fun for any of these people. But it's certainly not right to stand here and say things like that. Those aren't the facts at all, as you know them. Earlier I said that there had been an offer that doctors Lee and Baden and Wolf would assist the prosecution, not accepted, but they were out here, at least to the extent they were allowed to do things. You'll hear more about the testimony of Henry Lee on that. You remember how they rushed him to this thing when he came back from Seattle and how he was treated. That was the only time he seemed to be a little bit upset. He rushed back here from Seattle and how they treated him. This Los Angeles Police Department, that's how they treated the #1 criminals in the world in their search for truth. Then Detective Lang. Lang's different than these other detectives and things. You saw Lang for about 7 or 8 days. Lang is different. He made mistakes. He has misstatements, as you're going to see, but he was different. Remember that one day, and I'll tell you how you can characterize and understand he's different. It's very interesting. He's been on the stand for 7 or 8 days. One day he came in and he was a little different. He was a little more testy, it seemed, and I asked him. I said, Detective Lang, there's an article in the paper today. That's part of the evidence.
Well, it's in the record.
There's an article in the paper today where Mr. Darden says that you're being too nice in answering my questions. Are you going to be tougher now? You know about that, don't you? I said, no, Mr. Cochran, I'm just going to tell you the way it is, regardless. And no matter how you ask this man a question or what anybody would want him to say, he seemed to try and answer it as best he could. Now, we don't always agree with everything he did, but it was refreshing to have somebody like that. Wasn't going to be told by these prosecutors, anybody else, what to say or what to do, even when he's criticized in the paper. That was Lang, but I said I didn't always agree with him because I asked him, I said, when Risky said about that melting ice cream, now we're not Henry Lee, not by a long shot, but it seemed to me that if there were ice cream that was still melting or partially melted at 12:40 when Risky saw it, and that's Risky's testimony, partially melted ice cream at 12:40 that they don't bother picking up. And that ice cream, remember when you were at Bundy? That ice cream is when you go down those steps and it's on that little banister there as you're going out into the garage. Might mean that Nicole Brown Simpson went down there and was letting somebody out who'd been there earlier that evening. We'll never know. When they saw all those candles lit around the bathtub and water in the bathtub, we'll never know because they didn't bother checking. They were too worried about how they would look, notifying them, worrying about the press. We'll never know. They said the ice cream wasn't important, but it was important enough that they had, and this is the evidence, they had an ice cream melting test. Remember, I asked Lang about this again. Lang's experiment showed that this ice cream, it went back to Ben and Jerry's. It was Ben and Jerry's ice cream, remember that? It melted in 1 hour and 15 minutes. Should be totally melted by that time frame. If you extrapolate backwards, if Risky finds the ice cream at 12:40 and is partially melted, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, let's say it's all melted. If you went back 1 hour and 15 minutes, that's 11:25. Now, if the children are asleep, Nicole's the one eating that ice cream, that seems important to us. Maybe not to them. That seems important. That's another bit of evidence. When you cannot, because of negligence and incompetence, determine the cause of death, you have to look at other things. Isn't that reasonable? Those are the facts, ladies and gentlemen. That's what happened in this case. So they tell you it's not important. We think that is important. Another factor. And you remember that photograph in the kitchen where there's a butcher knife on the table and you see some flowers there? Seems to me that when they came home, that butcher knife was used to cut whatever was off the flowers, if it was a string or some rubber band, place those flowers in a vase or whatever, in that kitchen. You look at those photographs when you get a chance. And I'm always intrigued about the things they didn't do in this case, even risky. Who said, and it was candor was refreshing, have you had any training at crime scenes? He said, well, they kind of glossed over that at the academy. Remember he said that? People could have fallen over when he said that. They glossed over training at crime scenes at the academy. And boy, was that ever more true. The first officer on the scene told us that. We knew that right early on, didn't we? It's not anything we made up. It's not about being anti-police. You saw the police you could believe, and you now know the ones you can't believe. And anybody who believes that all police are perfect, that they don't lie, that they don't have the same biases and racism that the rest of society has, is living in a dream world. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is not for the timid. As I said, this is for the courageous who understand what the Constitution is all about. That's what we're talking about here. And so let's look at risky at the very outset. In addition, he doesn't get any training, but he goes in the house and the first thing he does, he picks up the phone and uses it. I said, well, didn't you think that might mar some fingerprints? Or if it had one of those numbers where you could get the last number call, wouldn't that be important? Did you think about that? Well, they didn't think about that. Did you think about the fact that, you know, that you shouldn't be touching that phone and you have a rover? You have some on your hip, some way to call. You could have used those portable phones that Phillips had with all those private numbers on them. You could have done all those things, but you didn't use any of those things. You walked in there and then you didn't notice that on that phone in the kitchen, when they're looking so hard for Mr. Simpson, that there's a speed dialer that you press a button and it says Dad, and it says Nana, and it says all the people. If they'd wanted to notify the next of kin, when they press the button, they could have called Nana. But not these investigators. They didn't think about doing that. They're too busy hatching a plan, standing around in the street, doing nothing from 2 till 4:30. These are the facts. This is what you heard. This is this case, the so-called trial of the century. This is how they conducted themselves. And then we come to those socks. Those socks. They just don't fit. They just don't fit. They just don't fit. Watch with me now a video. I want you to watch the time counter in this time frame, and you'll understand how important this is. Now where it says 3:13 p.m., Mr. Willie Ford says, all right, back it up, please. This is Mr. Willie Ford going up into the bedroom. It's 3:13, which he says is 4:13 because it hadn't been changed. This is 4:13 p.m. on June 13th, 1994. Okay, thank you, Howard. You look at the foot of the bed there, where the socks are supposed to be. You'll see no socks in this video. And you'll recall that Mr. Willie Ford testified about this. And I asked him, well, where are the socks, Mr. Ford? I didn't see any socks. So now that's interesting, isn't it? At 4:13 on June 13th, 1994, these socks, they supposedly recovered. These mysterious socks. These socks that no one sees any blood on until August 4th, all of a sudden. These socks that are picked up, that Looper says he picks them up because they just look out of place. I don't have any reason to pick them up. I'll just take these socks. They're out of place. The only items that they took out of that place on that day is Lang. Lang takes the Reebok tennis shoes, the ones he takes home. You remember that? That's all they really take because they don't come back on the 28th before they get that one brown glove. But these socks will be their undoing. It just doesn't fit. None of you can deny there are no socks at the foot of that bed at 4:13 p.m. Where then are the socks? Where are these socks? It's an important piece of evidence. Well, let me show you something. This board here was a board used by Dr. Henry Lee. And this is interesting. Bear with me for a moment as you look at this.
52. Thank you.
In this photograph here, the one on the left, Your Honor, so you notice something. The socks are at the foot of the bed. If you look close at this photograph, you'll see it. There's no little white card there. You notice how they put these little evidence cards there when they're going to collect something. No little white card on this photograph here. And this is interesting because you see these straps on the bed. Now, Looper told us when he testified, these straps were like, he called them some kind of luggage straps. And these luggage straps are down at this point, aren't they? See how they're down? And no evidence card. The socks are there. And we come over to this photograph here. You notice how the strap is now up on the bed. It's no longer hanging down anymore. It's been moved up, and Looper says that's when he looks under this bed and he sees that photograph. By the way, how wrong can they continue to be? That's no wedding photograph. That's a photograph they took at some formal event. You look at that photograph and see. That's how they speculate, and most times they've been wrong. But this is interesting. The strap is now up on the bed. And you look at the socks. Now it's been posed for you. Here's this number 13 out here with these socks. Now, if you look back at that video, and you'll have it, you'll notice that the video has the strap down. So the video is at a time before this card is placed, before the strap is up, before this is about to be collected. Now, isn't that strange? Because at 4:13, there are no socks there. Now, how do we tie all this together? You remember Fung and Mazzola have a log. And on their log, they tell when they collected things. They tell us that they collected the blood in the foyer at 4:30. That they then come upstairs. That they collect. Here it is as we speak. 291, Your Honor. Got to move it over a little bit, Mr. Harris, I think. Do we? Now you see this. Where they collected things sequentially, and they kept this log. And I think that you'll remember the testimony that at 4:30, they collected the blood in the foyer. Remember that? Let me see if I can point that out for us. In foyer, red stain. And there's testimony. They testified at 4:30. 16:30 is 4:30. This is at least 17 minutes after Mr. Ford's up there with that camera where there are no socks, right? So 16:30, right there. They're downstairs. Then they say they go upstairs. They leave this time blank, but at 16:40, they go and they look at this little red spot in the bathroom. Remember that? And they say in their testimony that the socks are collected between 16:30 and 16:40. So that's given the benefit of the doubt. 16:35. How could the socks be there at 4:35 when you just saw they're not there at 4:13? Who's fooling whom here? They're setting this man up, and you can see it with your own eyes. You're not naive. Nobody's foolish here. And then they forget about this little strap exercise. When they're posing stuff here, they move this off the bed, move this under the bed. They're going to make a big thing about this photograph under the bed. And then they put this number down here and they take these pictures for you later. But they didn't know that we would know or find out about Mr. Ford's video. See, they took that video. You know, we talked about this early on. LAPD should always take videos of everything at that crime scene. They don't do that. But they took this video, not because they wanted to help Mr. Simpson. If anything was missing or got broken, this was a civil liability video. Remember, they was going around taking photographs of things that might be missing or whatever, if there was ever a suit later on. But they got hoisted by their own petard again, because the video has the counter and the number. They will never, ever be able to explain that to you, because we got their testimony in black and white as to when they went upstairs and collected this. Those socks from the beginning have been a thorn, and it's going to bring them down. So those are the socks, these socks. No dirt, no soil, no berries, no trace. Nobody sees any blood until August 4th. And all these miraculous things start happening. And then, Mr. Sheck will talk more about this, then we find out it has EDTA on it. It's a planet along with that back gate. How would it be on there? Why didn't they see the blood before that? There's a big fight here. Where's the dirt? Why would Mr. Simpson have on these kind of socks with the sweat outfit? Wait a minute. Now, you don't have to be like from the fashion police to know that. You don't wear those kind of socks. You wear those kind of socks with a suit. You don't wear those kind of socks with a sweat outfit. Doesn't make sense to you that those socks were in that hamper from Saturday night when Mr. Simpson went to that formal event. Those kind of socks is what you wear with your tuxedo when he was dressed with those other ladies. If they went and took it out of the hamper and staged it there, then you see what happened. Is that not reasonable under these facts? I think you'll agree it is. It's the only reasonable explanation if it's posed there, and the reason for doing this is because they were out of place. But isn't that interesting? In the hamper in which Looper went and they all went, they didn't take anything else. You think the police would ask, Mr. Simpson, what were you wearing in addition to suits? What were you wearing that night? They didn't take one thing. Yet we hear all of this talk about, wonder where the clothes went, wonder where the clothes went. You think Mr. Simpson, who told them everything, who cooperated with them fully, told them like he told them about those shoes, what he was wearing? They didn't bother collecting those, did they? No towels, no nothing. She's worried about him taking this quick shower. If he took a shower and there's so much blood and he's covered with blood, why didn't they bring the towels in here? Something is wrong in this case. It just doesn't fit. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. So the socks, I could talk about these socks forever, but I'm not going to because Mr. Scheck will talk about the forensic aspect of it. But let me just remind you of two quick more things. Dr. Herb McDonald came in here and he told you there was no splatter or spatter on these socks. These socks had compression transfer. And he used his hands to show you somebody took those socks and they put something on them. And it went all the way through to side 3. Now, with all their experts, bring people back 3, 4 times, they never had anybody to contravene that. How'd that get over to side 3? How'd it get over there? It wouldn't get there if there was a leg in the sock. Can anybody explain that? Any of you explain that? Maybe Ms. Clark can explain that. The experts can't explain it. Something is wrong. And then finally, the EDTA, which indicates the anticoagulant from a purple top tube. That's where that blood is from. The socks, as you know, is something that one can get emotional about because we've known about these socks for some time. This is, to say the least, disturbing. It's worse than that, though. In my opening statement, I told you about evidence that would be compromised, contaminated, and corrupted. And I told you something then. I said, in this case, there's something even far more sinister. The socks are one example of that. Now, if you want to be fair, decide in this case, you got to deal with these socks. You'll get a chance to see them. Look for the dirt that you expect on them. Look for the spatter that you expect on them. Look and see why it went over to side 3. There's a leg in it. And, you know, isn't it interesting how you get this blood on this sock with your pants? Your pants have to be almost up. This would take a real contortion to do it. There's no way they can explain it. So let's just leave it where it is, and Mr. Scheck will pick up on that. And then we've heard a lot about the so-called blood in the Bronco. And I want to tell you I'm not anything like a scientist. In fact, when my mother and my father wanted me to become doctors, I didn't because I wasn't that good in science. So I became a lawyer so I could talk. But let me tell you something. Even I know about amounts of blood, especially after this case. They tell you about all this blood in the Bronco. And you remember one of the early witnesses testified the total amount of blood on this console is 0.07 of a drop of blood. Now that's supposedly a mixture of Goldman and someone else. So now I'm going to do a little Henry Lee experiment, and I hope that it doesn't cause you any problems. Now, .07 of a drop.
Douglas, you're going to have to take this down.
That is your Honor. .07 of a drop. Not even that much is the amount, the testimony in this case is, of the alleged blood on that console. Now, this is an amazing thing because you remember this is the vehicle in tradition of everything else they did in this case that's picked up. It's towed away from Rockingham. You've all seen that photograph. It's taken over and ultimately it ends up at Vertel's. Remember Blazzini? William Blazzini. Before we got to Blazzini, we dealt with John Mraz. Mraz says that the vehicle was just open. You can just go get in it. The press was waiting for him before he even drove it back. Everybody knew this was O.J. Simpson's vehicle, and they were all looking at it, supposedly for all this blood that's supposed to be in here. And this killer must have been covered in blood. And they say he drove this Bronco, and he got in the, it'd be covered with blood, wouldn't it? So everybody's looking for the blood. So Mraz said, he gets inside the car, he didn't see any blood. Mraz said that. They maligned Mraz because Mraz said, yeah, I did take those receipts out of there that had, one had Mr. Simpson's name on it, one had Mrs. Simpson's name on it. But he said he didn't see any blood in there. They never called anybody to contravene that, but we want to make sure you understood what was happening. So we called William Blazzini, the man who works for Pick Your Part as far as vehicles. And he was a pretty good witness, wasn't he? He said, look, this is my business, is looking in cars because I go in and buy them. He says, I got in that car on June 21st. And first of all, I said, I went looking for blood because I'd heard in the news there's going to be lots of blood in this car. So I went and got in the Bronco. It was not secured as usual. Bob Jones said, oh, there it is over there. Go get in it. Now, this is the same vehicle. No holes on it. Could be released to Hertz. LAPD at work. He gets in the car on the driver's side where he stays almost 5 minutes, looking down, looking for blood, looking in the front. And remember, he takes his fingerprints or hands and puts them in the mirrors, kind of like a souvenir, in the right front window of the car. Doesn't see any blood. He looks all over for blood. Then he gets out, walks around, and I guess on the rear panel, says, I'll leave him again. Puts his fingerprints there again. And he walks around, looks inside the driver's side, looks back, looks all down on the console, looking for blood. He's looking for blood, ladies and gentlemen, on June 21st. Doesn't see any blood. Then he gets in the car. I ask him, did you look on the dash? Did you look on the door? Did you look on the console? Doesn't see any blood. He says that the patch on the bottom was cut out, the floor mat there. Doesn't see any blood. And Miss Clark cross-examined this man. He said, look, Bronco's kind of high up. When I was getting ready to get in there, I rested my hands on the thing, and I looked right up there, and there was no blood in that Bronco. Now, this is very strange, isn't it? Here's the Bronco that has blood that appears, disappears, and then reappears, and then disappears. This is a vehicle that's supposed to be secure, but it's not secure. Everybody gets in it. Mraz got in it, takes stuff out that could have been helpful. We know that there was a receipt in there from Nicole Brown Simpson. There's testimony. She rides and drives that car on occasion. That's forever lost to us because they didn't do their jobs again. Blazzini comes along. There's no blood in there. How do you explain all this when they talk about, they stand up here and talk about an ocean of evidence and, I mean, as I said, is a little tiny trickle of a stream, if anything. They're just words that they use. So this Bronco is particularly troubling. Less than that, 7/10 of that drop of blood is what's in that alleged console. Dr. Batten says the perpetrator would be covered with blood. Your common sense tells you the perpetrator would be covered with blood. A 5 to 15 minute battle and struggle of this dimensions. And so, it just doesn't fit. Something is wrong. How does anyone drive away in that car with bloody clothes, with no blood there on the seats, no blood anyplace else? Every police officer came in, talked about how bloody this scene was. It doesn't make any sense. You can't explain it because Mr. Simpson was not in that car and didn't participate in these murders. That's the reasonable and logical explanation. None other will do. And it's too late for them to change now with these kind of shifting theories. So the prosecution then has no shoes, no weapon, no clothes. They don't have anything except these socks, which appear all of a sudden under these circumstances. Now, when you want to think about the depths to which people will go to try to win, when you want to talk about an obsession to win, I'm going to give you an example. There was a witness in this case named Thano Paradas. This is a man who's their man who took O.J. Simpson's blood. This is a man who had a subpoena at one point, said he could have come down there and testified. They didn't call him. So by the time we wanted to call him, he's unavailable because of his heart problem, remember? So what we did was we read you his grand jury testimony, I believe, and we played for you his preliminary hearing testimony. And in that testimony, he was very, very consistent. Been a nurse for a number of years. You saw him. Works for the city of Los Angeles. Says that when he took this blood from O.J. Simpson on June 13th, he took between 7.9 and 8.1 cc's of blood. That's what he said. That's real simple, isn't it? We knew that. It's sworn, tell the truth, under oath, both places. Grand jury and preliminary hearing. Pretty clear, isn't it? Pretty clear. Except you remember that in my opening statement I told you, I said, you know, something's wrong here. Something sinister is here. Something is wrong. Because if we take all their figures and assume they took 8 cc's of blood, the 6.5 cc's accounted for, there is 1.5 cc's missing of this blood. There's some missing blood in this case. Where is it? Prosecution wants to explain that for you too, make everything real easy for you. So what do they do? What do they do? We've been talking about the police here before, but what do they do? Hank Goldberg doesn't give us any notice. Goes out there with the video camera with Oppler and this other lady, Miss Ramirez. And they take this bizarre home video of Paradas sitting there talking and mouthing words. It's the most bizarre thing. I mean, as jurors, I'm sure you've seen some pretty high quality testimony here. But this was bizarre. He's sitting there talking about, well, you know, gee, I don't really remember how much I took, and he's going through all these gyrations. It was sad, the depths to which they had sunk to try, as part of this cover-up, to try and convince you that this man hadn't taken 8 cc's of blood. And at the very end of this case, we put in a syringe for you, the kind of syringe they used. And this syringe, is interesting enough, has markers on it. Not only, this wasn't a guessing game, it has 8 cc's right on it. I think it was a 10 cc syringe. So he knew what was taken. But that's the depths to which they will go to try to make it fit. And it just doesn't fit. That's what they'll do. You have to watch them. This is a classic example. You saw it with your own eyes. You heard the testimony. Need I say more? Is that a classic example? And then there's another concrete example. Let's take Miss Laura McKinney. By all accounts, a nice and gentle lady who didn't want to be here. You heard the testimony. I had to go all the way to North Carolina to try to get these tapes. I had to go all the way to the North Carolina Court of Appeals to get these tapes. She comes here. She has proof about what she says. You know, there's conversations and there's conversations, but she has the conversations on tape. These prosecutors, if you don't fit, you're going to have trouble. So much so that Mr. Darden is questioning her. Remember her famous response? Quote, "Why are we having this adversarial conversation? Why do I detect this negativity? I'm just here to tell the truth. Aren't you in a search for truth? Mr. Prosecutor? She said that. And then they wanted to ask, well, why didn't you stop him from using this so-called N-word? She said, I was in a journalistic mode. I didn't try to stop him from using that word any more than I tried to stop him from talking about cover-ups where male police officers have no respect for women police officers because they don't cover up the misdeeds. But that was her testimony. From that witness stand, you saw her. She's credible, don't you think? She has tapes to back her up. But look how she was treated by this. And Mr. Darden said something very interesting today. He said, I'm just the messenger. Now, how many times have you heard that? I'm the messenger. Don't blame me. I'm just doing my job. There's no way out. He's a fine lawyer, but he can't hide behind just being the messenger. Well, whose message is he sending? Who is he representing in this message? He's a man of integrity. That statement is not going to fly. I'm just the messenger. He's not any messenger. He's the prosecutor with all the power of the state of California in this case. We're not going to let that get away. They're not going to turn the Constitution on its head in this case. We're not going to allow it. And so now let me bring you to a segment of this discussion where we talk about if you can't trust the messengers, watch out for their message. Van Adder, the man who carries the blood. Furman, the man who finds the glove. Remember those two phrases. Van Adder, the man who carries the blood. Furman, the man who found the glove. Now, Detective Van Adder has been a police officer for 27, 28 years, an experienced LAPD robbery homicide man. He was put on this case because of his experience, presumably, because they had the resources downtown. You know what time he got there and knew what happened. One of the things that has been totally unexplainable to me is the fact that here you have Mr. Simpson cooperating fully, gives his blood, and he gives 8 cc's of blood, we now know. Van Adder, the blood is then turned over to Van Adder. Now, we know that he could have booked that blood in Parker Center, or he could have gone over to Piper Tech. You see these two residents here. Thank you, Mr. Douglas. And Your Honor, this is, okay, this is just the board. Apparently there's not a number on this. He's at Parker Center, right over here in the police building, right down here at 150 North Los Angeles Street. Takes this blood. Could have gone a couple of floors and booked the blood. Their manual requires. But he didn't do that, did he? Could have gone over to Piper Tech, another facility right downtown here, and booked that blood. This is the reference sample of Mr. O.J. Simpson. He doesn't do that. What he does is he goes way out to this area marked Brentwood Heights. Must be 20, 25 miles, 20-some miles to go way out there, carrying the blood in this unsealed gray envelope, supposedly. Why is he doing that? Why is Van Adder carrying Mr. Simpson's blood out there? Why is he doing that? Doesn't make any sense. Violates their own rules. Why is he doing that in this case? Has he ever done it in any other case? No. Name another case where this has happened. Or you can ask him those questions all the time with Bushy. Officer Bushy, when have you ever sent 4 people, 4 detectives over to notify somebody who's not even the next of kin? Well, Mr. Cochran, there must be somebody, but I can't name you a case. There are no cases. These are the things they did in this case. So he goes way out there with that blood. Why did he do that? Doesn't make any sense. And so we know because much of what happened here is on video. It's the strangest thing about this blood. He can't explain either why he carries it out there. And then it gets even stranger, doesn't it? Because supposedly, after the blood is carried out to O.J. Simpson's residence, Van Adder gives the blood to Fung, according to what we hear. But Fung then uses some kind of a trash bag, a black trash bag, and gives it to Mazzola, but he doesn't tell her that it's blood. Isn't that bizarre? You remember the video when Mazzola's walking along, carrying it, almost bumping into the hedges and the shrubbery? It's the most bizarre thing you've ever seen. She doesn't even know it. And then, talk about cover-ups, Mazzola's asked, well, did you see when Van Adder gave the blood to Fung? And she says, no, I had sat down on the couch and I was closing my eyes in Mr. Simpson's couch at that moment. I wasn't looking at that moment. Sound like a cover-up to you? Always looking the other way, not looking, don't want to be involved, covering for somebody? It's bizarre. Absolutely bizarre, and it's untrue. It doesn't fit. So Van Adder, the man who carries the blood, starts lying in this case from the very, very beginning, trying to cover up for this rush to judgment. Those are words. That's rhetoric. Let me prove it for you. He tells us, and this is a board. The board's entitled Van Adder's Big Lies, the man who carried the blood. He tells us that O.J. Simpson is not a suspect. That's the biggest lie we've heard probably in this entire trial. O.J. Simpson is not a suspect. They handcuff him within 30 to 45 seconds of the time he gets back here. He lies about that. Weitzman succeeds in getting him unhandcuffed, and they take him downtown. But he does more than that. Not only does he lie about that at the beginning, he then feels comfortable enough to talk to these two brothers, the Fiato brothers, and an FBI agent named Wax. And isn't this bizarre that the lead detective in this case, put on here because of his experience, is talking with these two guys who've been in this witness program for quite a while, testifying for the government. Now, we know that in a rather unusual set of circumstances, they're in a room somewhere in some hotel drinking beer. It's not even Van Adder's case. And they're sitting around talking. And I asked the FBI agent, weren't you a little surprised that a detective would be talking to these two people about the Simpson case? Well, we found out that there was a relationship allegedly between Denise Brown and one of these brothers, and maybe he felt comfortable. But why would he do that? And what does he say? He tells them that we didn't go up there to save any lives. O.J. Simpson was a suspect. The husband is always the suspect. But then he comes into court here, this lead detective, takes the stand again and lies to you under oath. Says, oh, well, no, I never said that, never said that. That'd be a mistake if they said that. I never made that statement. He lied. He lied from the very beginning. He lied when they went over there. Then they bring in Commander Bushy, an otherwise good man. They get him involved in this. Let me tell you something interesting about what you heard about Phillips's voice. Phillips was talking to the coroner's office about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning on June 13th. The man asked him to identify, well, yes, we have one male, female, one white female, one white male, as though he didn't know the names or whatever. Now, this is 5.5 hours after Bushy said, go over and notify O.J. Simpson, who's not even the next of kin, because we don't want the family to find out about this like they did in the Belushi case. Remember he said that? Now, he's doing all this from his house, from his home. Phillips, if you look through his testimony, look back through your notes as to when he says he knows who this person is. But isn't it amazing that the children are already down at the station? They're at her house. They got a phone with a speed dialer. They know. Bushy knows. They don't follow his orders out. They stand out in the street, not investigating, stand out in the street, planning, doing whatever they're going to do. But one thing they do, they decide that O.J. Simpson is a suspect in this case. And let me tell you why you're going to know that. They want to talk a lot about 1985, but he missed the whole point. In 1985, something interesting happened in this case. In 1985, Mark Furman responded to a call on Rockingham. Mark Furman is a lying, perjuring, genocidal racist. And from that moment on, anytime he could get O.J. Simpson, he would do it. That's when. It started in 85 when Farrell asked all the officers at West LA, or 10 of them, you know anything about this residence? Only one steps forward. And what does he say? It's indelibly impressed in my mind, that call back in 85. 4 years later, sits down and writes a report. And now, he knew what he was going to do on this particular night. So, O.J. not a suspect, went to save lives. They wanted to get a search warrant. That's why they were lying. Denies the statement to Wax and Fiato. Then, to get that search warrant, he lies to a judge. He says in the search warrant that O.J. left unexpectedly from Chicago. And there's some writing on the search warrant. I think it's in evidence. And it's kind of interesting because everybody knew. Cato knew he was going to Chicago. Everybody knew he was going to Chicago. It wasn't any unexpected trip, but I suppose it would help out. In fact, if you think about it, Ms. Clark said this. Well, that's why those socks were out there and everything, because he left in a hurry, like he had one pair of socks. You know why those socks were out there. He left unexpectedly to try and justify what they were doing. It all comes back to Furman when he says in that letter, if I see an interracial couple, I'll stop them. If I don't have a reason, I'll make up a reason. This man thinks he's above the law. And even Darden, Mr. Christopher Darden, my friend, has to admit, he said it was textbook what's happened to their witness, not our witness. And so he lies to the judge. He lied to the judge. He's lied to you, his jurors. Then he says that Arnell and Cato said O.J. left unexpectedly. That's written in the warrant. Never say anything of the kind. Cato knew this was a planned trip for Hertz. He talked to Kathy Randa. Then in the search warrant, he puts that it was confirmed there was human blood on the door. That's never been tested, even to this day. Another lie in this search warrant. He denies telling Thompson the order to handcuff O.J. Simpson. Then he lies about O.J. Simpson's blood. Remember during his testimony, he got that blood about 2:30, and he was trying to push it back an hour, so well, like maybe 3:30, because he had to explain, it's hard to explain those hours in there. What's he walking around with this man's blood for? For 3 hours before he goes back out to Rockingham at 5:30? What's he doing with his blood? So he has an hour in there, and you look at his testimony, he lies about between 2:30 and 3:30. And then Furman testifies, between these two, I don't know who you can believe. When Furman testifies, something about that, when he talks to Cato, Cato tells him about these thumps, that he doesn't tell anybody about it. He's so central to this case. He's got to be the big man and go solve this entire case. He doesn't tell the rest of them. Remember, he goes off all by himself for 15 minutes. Just walking around, he goes off by himself somewhere, supposedly where he supposedly finds this glove. No opportunity? We'll be talking about that. But Van Adder comes in and says, well, yes, the Furman told me about the thumps on the wall, contrary to what Furman had said. So these are the lies of the co-lead detective in this case. If you cannot trust the messenger, you can't trust the message that they're trying to give you. You can't trust the message. So this man who starts to lie from the very, very beginning, I'll leave it up just a second. We covered the lies and the things that he did. And then they rope in Commander Bushy to try to back him up by saying, well, I'd ordered them to do this, a direct order to do this. But isn't that interesting now? Let's think about this. You look at those logs and see how many police officers came out to Bundy and Rockingham. Maybe more than 30. You think that of those number of officers, that maybe one of them, maybe one of the patrol officers could have went to give the notice? It took all 4 detectives, all 4 LAPD experienced detectives to leave the bodies. They had notified the coroners. They didn't have a criminalist to go over to notify O.J. Simpson. Who's fooling who here? This is preposterous. They're lying. Let's try to get over that wall, to get in that house. If you don't believe so, you're talking about saving lives? Remember what Arnell said. First of all, they all make this big mistake. They forget, and they say, well, when we leave from the back, we go right in that back door of the house there. We go right in the back door. But they forgot. Arnell Simpson comes in here and testifies, you can't go in the back door because, remember, Cato had put on the alarm. You had to go around the house to the front. Arnell had to open the keypad to let them in. Remember? You think who knows better? You think she knows better or they know better? She had to open the door to let them in. They're so worried about dead bodies and people being in that house and saving lives. Who goes in first? Arnell Simpson goes in first. These big, brave police officers. And the young lady just walks on in there first. They don't go upstairs looking. They just want to be inside that house and make her leave. But give Furman a chance to start what he's doing, strolling around the premises and doing what he's doing there. Then we come to Detective Phillips, a nice man, but even he makes misstatements in this situation. Now, he knows Furman probably better than anybody because he's the one who calls Furman. He's the one who works with Furman. Now, Furman, in the culture of LAPD, has been promoted. We have heard that in '85, when he goes out to this incident, he's a patrol officer. Now he's a detective, moving up in the ranks, working with Phillips. And Phillips calls him after 1 o'clock. Furman's been somewhere down at La Quinta in the desert, and he comes back supposedly, and he gets his call to respond to this location. And even Detective Phillips, in this case, and I examined him, when asked, well, Furman told you, didn't he, about his going out on that call in '85 about this so-called domestic discord, and then the '89 situation. You knew about that, didn't you? Phillips, oh, no, I never knew anything. Nobody told me anything. I don't know anything about that. No, I didn't. And then Lang comes in here. And in Lang and Van Atter's report, right in the report, and it's in evidence, Exhibit 1021, Lang directly impeaches Phillips. That Phillips did tell him about the '85 incident. The Furman had told him he'd been out on it. Why would he do that? Now, these are facts, ladies and gentlemen. This is what happened in this case before your very eyes. Not anything I'm making up. And who would know Mark Furman better in this case? His lack of credibility, his lying, racist views than Ron Phillips, his supervisor, who apparently chose to look the other way. And I'm sure he's as embarrassed as anybody else by this disgrace, Furman. So it's important at the outset that we understand the role of Phillips as we need to understand the role of Van Atter. He was the one allegedly given this order by Bushy to go over and give the death notification. He didn't comply with it until much later. And presumably the reason they were going to go over was to give the notice to Mr. Simpson, and Furman was going because he was needed. Now, can you imagine this? Furman, with his views, genocidal views, was going to go over to give notice to O.J. Simpson to help O.J. Simpson in his time of need. Can you imagine that? He's going over there to help him with his kids. That is ludicrous. So from risky to bushy, you've seen and are seeing a part of this code of silence, this cover-up. The cover-up that Laura McKinney talks about, where male officers get together, cover up for each other, don't tell the truth, hide, turn their head, cover. You can't trust this evidence. You can't trust the messenger. You can't trust the message. When Furman gets on the witness stand and says, I haven't used this N-word for 10 years, think Phillips knows he's lying? Some of you probably knew he was lying. But it took those tapes to make those of you who didn't believe that these kind of things exist to take place. Didn't he have an obligation to come forward under those circumstances? For if Furman would speak so candidly to this lady that he met in a restaurant in West LA, you think he talks like that to the guys on the force? She talked about, he said those words in police administration and police procedures. That's the way he talks. That's the way he is. Nobody came forward to reveal this. We revealed it for you. And let me just take a moment. This whole thing about the police and what they've done in this case is extremely painful to us, and I think to all right-thinking citizens. Because you see, we live in Los Angeles and we love this place. But all we want is a good and honest police force where people are treated fairly, no matter what part of the city they're in. That's all you want. So in talking to you about this, understand there is no personal pride. But I told you when we started, this is not for the weak or for the faint of heart. And so let's move on. Then, just wanted to show you this part from Detective Phillips. This is what was asked of Phillips at 15084. Mr. Simpson and Miss Nicole Brown Simpson had been embroiled in previous domestic discord situations, one of these resulting in Mr. Simpson having to go to court. You told them that too, didn't you? Answer, Phillips, I never told him that. He's talking about to Lang. So if, my question, if Detective Lang so indicates in his report, he's wrong. Answer, if he tells you that, I told him that, he may have learned that from Detective Furman, but he didn't get the information from me. I never knew that. Then when Lang came in, I asked him the question about this same area. I asked Lang this question. So let's look at it together. Does that report indicate that Phillips stated that victim Brown was the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, the well-known athlete actor? Answer, yes, it does. And does it say, additionally, Phillips stated that Mr. Simpson and victim one had been embroiled in previous domestic violence situations, one of which resulted in the arrest of Mr. Simpson? Does the report say that? Yes, it does. And he goes on to talk about, Phillips told you that, didn't he? And he goes on and says, but he told you this before you went over to Rockingham. Isn't that correct? Answer, yes. And so even Phillips was then impeached. And then Phillips tried as best he could to be a team player. It seems as though they got together, and Ms. Clark tried to make a big thing out of this, but here's how he described Mr. O.J. Simpson when he told him that Miss Nicole Brown Simpson had been found dead. What do you mean she's been killed? Oh my God, Nicole is dead. Do you recall that testimony? Yes. What do you mean she's been killed? Oh my God, Nicole is dead. Now, is that a question or is that a question? What do you mean she's been killed? They want to make something, I mean, is that preposterous? And then he goes on to say, he became upset and made that statement. Then he continued to be upset, continued to talk on the phone to himself. It took me several seconds to get him to talk to me again, to have him listen to me. And he seemed very upset. And these prosecutors would tell you, oh boy, that's something unusual about that. Anything unusual about that? What do you think? He just kept repeating over and over again that Nicole had been killed. Eventually, when I got his attention again, is when I mentioned the children. You have to remember, this conversation took place very quickly. He was talking, and I was talking, and everybody was a little excited. That's what Phillips said. And so, again, what I hope that I've done here is to let you share exactly what the testimony was. Then I asked Arnell about it. She said he was very upset. He was crying. He was saying, Arnell, I don't understand. He was very upset, emotional. Have you ever, at any time in your then 25 years, heard your father sound like that? Answer, no. She says he was upset, distraught, emotional. And then she describes him on that evening after he comes back from Chicago. He was seated with my grandmother, my Aunt Shirley, Bob Kardashian was there, the family and friends. Some of his friends were coming and going. This was in the family room. Now, with regard to his demeanor and how he appeared, describe again for the jury how he appeared before he left the room to go to some other place. How did he appear to you then? He was just very upset. He was crying off and on. We were watching the news, and he kept talking to the TV saying, you know, I can't believe this, I can't believe this. In shock, upset, and disbelief. And I've read the other part for you about the police officers going in the back door, but she describes how they walk around and she opens the alarm. And she's the one that went in and let the police in, and she's the one who walked in first. And then even Tom Lang. It's a personal favorite of mine, but in his instance, I think there are probably more mistakes than anything else. Human foibles, and he seems to be quite different than some of the others. Remember, he told us how he took these tennis shoes that O.J. Simpson told him he was wearing. And I said, what'd you do with those tennis shoes? He said, well, I took the tennis shoes and I put them in the trunk of my car. And I was going to take them home for the night because it was too late to book them. Then we looked at this video. And the tennis shoes he got, remember, he put the tennis shoes in the front seat with him. Maybe he stopped halfway up the road on the freeway and put them in the trunk. But that's not what he did then. And then he was part of the group who says O.J. was not a suspect. Turns his head, perhaps. Maybe that's his partner. But you notice he wasn't involved in this whole debacle with these Fiato brothers and Agent Wax. He wasn't involved. He's smarter. He wouldn't let that happen. And you know what? It's interesting because it's his case. That's his case that they're working on. You see him come running in here, trying to cover for anybody. He didn't do that, to his credit. And then we come, before we end today, to Detective Mark Furman. This man is an unspeakable disgrace. He's been unmasked for the whole world for what he is, and that's hopefully positive. His misdeeds go far beyond this case because he bespeaks a culture that's not tolerable in America. But let's talk about this case. People worry about this is not the case of Mark Furman. Well, it's not the case of Mark Furman. Mark Furman is not in custody. He's not. That's the man who they're trying to put away with witnesses like this, a corrupt police officer who is a liar and a perjurer. You know, they were talking yesterday in their argument about, well, they said, well, gee, would you just think he would commit a felony? What do you think it was when he was asked the questions by F. Lee Bailey? So well put. And we'll talk about that at the very end, about whether he'd ever used the N-word in 10 years. And he swore to tell the truth. And he lied, and others knew he lied. But what I find particularly troubling is that they all knew about Mark Furman. And they weren't going to tell you. They tried to ease him by. Of all the witnesses who've testified in this case, how many were taken up to the grand jury room where they have this prep session? They ask him all these questions. And Ms. Clark, and I went back and I read again her introduction of Mark Furman. How many witnesses did they do that with? Well, they took him up there and they prepared him for this because, you see, they knew about the Kathleen Bell letter, but she didn't fit. She didn't fit in what they wanted. They didn't want her. They'd rather malign her and believe this lying police officer. So they knew. Make no mistake about it. And so, when they try to prepare him, talk to him, and get him ready, and make him seem like a choir boy, make him come in here and raise his right hand as though he's going to tell you the truth and give you a true story here. He knew he was a liar and a racist. There's something about good versus evil. There's something about truth. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. You can always count on that. And so when Ms. Clark so gently puts him on the stand and talks to him about, tell us how you feel about testifying today. Nervous? Okay. Reluctant? And all the things about this bad lady, Kathleen Bell. They brought it out at the beginning. This bad Kathleen Bell saying all these mean things about you. Oh, and you don't know her even, do you? We asked you to look at her on the Larry King show, and you didn't recognize her. You don't know her. Oh, well, it's just terrible, all these bad things are happening to you, Detective Furman. You go back and you look at your notes of how the testimony was as they tried to bring him in here and pass him off. These things were all happening. The Kathleen Bell letter was in 85 and 86. Same time he went out to O.J. Simpson's house in 85 that they want to talk so much about. What they're talking about is not even relevant. What we're talking about now is what happened in this case. And so, after having made all these denials and been adopted and accepted by the prosecution and put him on the stand, and you saw it. It was sickening. And then, my colleague Lee Bailey, who can't be with us today, but God bless him wherever he is, did his cross-examination of this individual. And he asked some interesting questions. Some of you probably wonder, well, gee, wonder if he's asking that. He asked this man whether or not he'd ever met Kathleen Bell. Of course, he lied about that. Never met this woman. I don't recognize her. I don't know her. Gee, I don't know anything about that. Boy, and he sounded really convincing, didn't he? He says, quote, I do not recognize this woman as anybody I have ever met. That's what he says. Then Bailey says, have you used that word, referring to the N-word, in the past 10 years? Not that I recall, no. You mean if you call someone a nigger, you have forgotten it? I'm not sure I can answer the question the way it's phrased, sir, and they go on. He says, Bailey then pins him down. I want you to assume that perhaps at some time since 1985 or 86, you addressed a member of the African-American race as a nigger. Is it possible that you have forgotten that act on your part? Answer, no, it is not possible. Are you therefore saying that you have not used that word in the past 10 years, Detective Furman? Answer, yes, that is what I'm saying. Question, and you say under oath that you have not addressed any black person as a nigger or spoken about black people as niggers in the past 10 years, Detective Furman? That's what I'm saying, sir. So that anyone who comes to this court and quotes you as using that word in dealing with African Americans would be a liar. Would they not, Detective Furman? Yes, they would. All of them? Correct? All of them. That's what he told you under oath in this case. Did he lie? Did he lie? Did he lie under oath? Did this key prosecution witness lie under oath? And I'm going to end this part and resume with him tomorrow morning. Did he lie? And when they try to tell you he's not important, let's remember this man. This is the man who was off this case shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, right after he got on it. This is the man who didn't want to be off this case. This is the man, when they're ringing the doorbell at Ashford, who goes for a walk, and he describes how he's strolling. Let me quote him for you. Here's what he says. I was just strolling along, looking at the house. Maybe I could see some movement inside. I was just walking while the other 3 detectives were down there. And that's when he walks down, and he's the one who says the Bronco was parked askew, and he sees some spot on the door. He makes all of the discoveries. It's got to be the big man, because he's had it in for O.J. because of his views since 85. This is the man. He's the guy who climbs over the fence. He's the guy who goes in and talks to Cato Kalin while the other detectives are talking to the family. He's the guy who's shining a light in Cato Kalin's eyes. He's the guy looking at shoes and looking for suspects. He's the guy who's doing these things. He's the guy who says, I don't tell anybody about the thumps on the wall. He's the guy who's off this case, who's supposedly there to help this man, our client, O.J. Simpson, who then goes out all by himself. All by himself. Now, if he's worried about bodies or suspects or whatever, doesn't even take out his gun. He goes around the side of the house, and lo and behold, he claims he finds this glove. And he says the glove is still moist and sticky. Now, under their theory, at 10:45, that glove is dropped. How many hours is that? It's now after 6 o'clock. So what is that, 7.5 hours? It's a testimony about drying time around here. There's no dew point that night. Why would it be moist and sticky? Unless he brought it over there and planted it there to try to make this case. And there is a Caucasian hair on that glove. This man cannot be trusted. He is central to the prosecution. And for them to say he's not important is untrue, and you will not fall for it. Because as guardians of justice here, we can't let it happen. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Cochran, can you have it taken down, please?
That's right.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to conclude our evening session at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Do not discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case, conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.